The big issue is where people mistake, say, a running shoe. They are sold this belief that this shoe is better for your running because it's got all this tech in it. But then they also get this idea that that's the right shoe to be wearing all day, every day. So even if there is a shoe that can help your performance in running, that doesn't mean that that shoe is the right shoe to be wearing all day, every day for all of your activities.
Welcome to the Restore to Explore podcast from the Foot Collective. We're on a mission to empower humans to restore their natural health and function from the ground up, so we can all explore movement and life with freedom and confidence. Well, this episode is going to go into a pretty deep dive on something that's at the core of pretty much everything we do at TFC, or a lot of them.
The foot stuff.
The foot stuff. Yeah, definitely. So we're just going to deep dive into footwear because we get questions every single day about what shoe should I be wearing, what's a bad shoe, what's a good shoe. And we haven't really had an episode that's dived into the history of footwear, where shoes are at now, what people should do when they're looking for a shoe, and then what they should be doing with their bodies as they transition into wearing those shoes. So to start with, start things off, I guess I'll dive into the history of footwear. And this was pretty fun to do a bit of research. Nick did a podcast a couple of years ago on the history of footwear with Mike on the TFC audio project, and I listened to that and then did a bit more research just around, essentially how did we get to the position we're in today? Because it's pretty astounding when you consider where we've come from and how quickly we've been able to get into a situation where the Foot Collective even needs to exist. For 1.8 million years, Homo erectus walked the earth, and we've only been shod or been wearing shoes for about 2% of our existence, and that's a rough estimate. So in modern footwear terms, it's about 0.01% of our existence. So archaeologists have sort of traced back the beginning of footwear to about 40,000 years ago, 30 to 40,000 years ago, and that was all based on the smaller toes on the foot getting smaller. So it seemed as though they weren't being used as much, and that's where that sort of estimate comes from. But the first preserved pairs of footwear are about 10,000 years old, so usually like braided plant material, sandals or moccasins. There was a 3,500-year-old leather moccasin that was found in Armenia. And in 1991, the world's oldest naturally preserved mummy was actually found in the Alps between Austria and Italy, still wearing shoes. And those shoes were made from bear skin and deer skin. So there's sort of this history of, people designing footwear from what they had access to, essentially to protect their feet. So, Egyptians around 3,000 years ago wore thong sandals, and they were made from papyrus and palm leaves. But that's, sort of the earliest sign of shoes being designed not necessarily for function but more for fashion or status. So
Egyptians.
3,000 years ago, back to this period, women would wear narrow shoes designed specifically to change the shape of their foot as a display of status. So the idea was wide feet equaled slave, narrow foot equaled royalty, or a higher status within society.
Because by knowing this stuff, it kind of makes the craziness make more sense.
Yeah.
It's like we've lingered on to these social hierarchy perceptions around footwear. And even if people don't recognize it, I think, it's noticing that cute shoes are shoes that make your feet look small and compact. It's like this weird thing where it's like the thing people seek in fashion is actually the thing that deforms our body the most. And I think understanding this makes it sort of make a bit more sense in terms of where it came from, but it's still weird.
I think when you understand why they went with those narrow shoes as well, like the idea, it wasn't just because they looked pretty, the feet looked pretty, it was literally the idea that because you were wearing more narrow shoes that didn't allow your feet to function properly, it was a symbol of you not having to function properly in society or do the work of the slaves. So it wasn't necessarily I don't believe like it would have been born out of this idea that, oh, your narrow feet are pretty, as much as it was because your feet, you're in these silly shoes that don't allow you to do the work of the slave. You are therefore above the slave and immune to doing that work.
That's probably why the cultural meme of narrow feet and shoes are pretty, is because, well, it's actually tied to status.
Yeah.
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 Which makes a lot of sense.
So
interesting.
Yeah, so throughout the next sort of thousands and hundreds of years beyond that, in India there were sandals known as padukas, which were made of wood and they were like a wooden sandal that had like an extension that came up and then a knob between the big toe and the second toe. So there wasn't actually any strap. It was just like a knob that your big toe and second toe sort of sat between, and that held it onto your foot. Again, not super practical, but did the purpose of protecting the feet from the earth beneath. And then shoes in ancient times, and that's the other interesting thing is like, yes, there were these shoes in the Egyptian era that were designed specifically to deform the feet, but really often throughout ancient civilizations, shoes were really seen as an indulgence, and most people who were working preferred to go barefoot. Native Americans would wear moccasins, and the Native Americans would only really wear moccasins for comfort or warmth. It wasn't necessarily for function. It was just because it got so cold that you would wear shoes to cover your feet. But when it was hot or when it was wet, those shoes would come off because it wasn't practical.
Wouldn't function as well as if you're barefoot.
Yeah.
I can imagine. Yeah.
And then, what was probably the most interesting part of doing this research, I found that, so in caves in southwestern America, they've found actually hundreds if not thousands of pairs of sandals and moccasins that have been preserved in dry caves. So these caves deep beneath the earth. And the belief is that these caves were actually seen as a connection between the world above, our world, and the underworld. And so the shoes being the literal connection of the human to the ground beneath them, they essentially were left as like tributes in these caves. So a lot of the sandals and the shoes that were found in there, they weren't fresh sandals. They were actually worn through, and it was like once their purpose had been done and they'd connected the human with the earth, they were left to the caves, which was seen as the passage to the underworld, which I thought was pretty cool. And then another interesting point was a lot of these ancient sandals, actually, the soles of the sandals were all uniquely designed. So people would actually sort of engrave, I guess, or have different designs on the soles of their feet. And the idea behind this was that the footprints that were then left on the landscape were like a calling card of the person who'd left them. So you knew who had walked by, which I think is really cool. And it goes down to the... I think that sort of, it pays homage to the value and the care that was taken with footwear back then, and the individual nature of each pair of shoes being designed for that person. And even the fact that they were sort of left as tributes, not thrown away or dumped, but there was a process to show how important these were, I suppose. But yeah, right throughout history, the Vikings wore flexible, soft shoes made of cow leather. Ancient Olympians would compete barefoot. Alexander the Great's army won many battles barefoot. But interestingly, the Romans saw them as a symbol of power, sandals. So the higher the sandal went up the leg, the higher the rank of the soldier. Again, going to this whole idea of hierarchy being identified by the footwear that people are wearing. But then by the 10th century, common sense sort of began to slip, and we saw the first platform shoes emerging. So, up to this point, cultures had embraced footwear mostly that, were a means to an end. Like the idea, there was a purpose, the protection element, whether it was temperature or terrain. But in the 1360s, poulaines or krakauers became a trend, at first actually for men of status in Poland, and then that sort of spread across Europe. And those are the long pointed shoes that you could probably picture on a jester. And, these were actually, worn by noblemen as a display of their wealth and power. And the same sort of stories we saw in Egypt with, the narrow shoes, meaning that you didn't have to do the work. The pointy and practical footwear were, difficult to move in, and then suggested that they didn't have to do the same hard labour as the peasants they ruled. Funnily enough, this would actually backfire during the Battle of Simpak between Austria and the Swiss in 1386. So this source comes from actually Swiss journalists, I guess you'd call them, or reporters from that time period, who described this scene of piles upon piles of the ends of shoes. And so what had happened is the Austrian knights actually had to dismount and fight on foot during the battle because they were losing. But they couldn't run in their shoes because they were wearing these poulaines. So they had to chop the ends of them off. And the Swiss have sort of described these piles of the ends of their shoes, which just goes to how stupid and impractical the footwear that they were wearing to show their status was, and could have potentially cost people their lives because they were wearing these shoes. And then you have chopains, which were sort of narrow shoes with a high platform. They were popularized in the Victorian era by queens and royalty, and so it just kept on getting more extreme and more extreme. And interestingly enough, it got so extreme that laws were passed in England actually restricting the height of a person's shoe to their ranking. So based on your status in society meant how high of a platform you could wear underfoot, and peasants were not allowed to wear a heel at all. And that goes to this interesting sort of juxtaposition, because researchers from Cambridge in recent years actually dug up the bones of people from this era when they stumbled upon a mass grave site when some excavators were doing some work, and they analysed all of the bones, and they found that the people who were the noblemen or women whose big toes were more bent, bunions. The suggestion is that these were caused by the narrow shoes that the royalty were wearing. And interestingly enough, the people with those bunions, those bent toes, they actually found that they'd suffered more broken bones across their body, suggesting that the narrow shoes not only deformed their feet, but left them at a greater risk of suffering falls and serious injuries. Which is something that we sort of prey on, is the importance of having that wide, stable base. And as soon as you sort of push that tripod leg in, it makes you more unstable. And these remains suggest that was the case hundreds of years ago as well. So I think what's most interesting to me is really the connection between the height and hierarchy, and how that can be traced throughout cultures. And like you said, it's sort of like deeply ingrained in our
collective psyche. Yeah,
there's even chiefs of tribes who would walk on stilts to be the highest in the tribe and be supported by other tribespeople. Still though, I guess the important thing to remember is that the majority of society throughout the ages, royalty and the privilege was such a small portion of society, and a large portion of society still, wear shoes or didn't wear shoes that allowed their feet to function as naturally as possible. And then it all sort of changed when athletic footwear came to the scene. So at first the intent was, grounded in practicality. In 1895, J.W. Foster's and Sons, now known as Reebok, developed the first athletic shoe for runners. And the idea behind this made sense. They wanted extra traction and grip, so there were spikes on the bottom. And interestingly enough, only a few years earlier, around the same time, 1892, the American Rubber Company invented the first rubber soles. So, that athletic footwear started there and developed over the next 10, 20, 30 years until in 1921, when Converse released the Chuck Taylor. So they employed the backing of a professional basketballer to help them sell their basketball shoes, claiming that the high top sneakers that everyone still wears today would help protect their ankles from injury. And that was the line that they sort of went with. And it's interesting that tactic was employed, using someone of status to promote a narrow shoe
with a
that
high
went
top,
high up the ankle. It's it's very sort of
Symbolic,
reminiscent
yeah.
of what we saw with the Egyptians and the Romans, and I guess plays on that deep-rooted belief, that's generationally ingrained in us, that if you were wearing shoes like that, then it meant that you were higher in status. And then Adolf Dassler, or the founder of Adidas, created, sneakers that would sort of redefine the way people saw footwear. And I think the big thing that we saw over the next 100 years, I suppose, was shoes being designed for athletes, but then being worn by everyday people. And that was where the big danger came, is that while shoes were being promoted as, as great for basketballers to protect ankle rolls, even if that was or wasn't the case, it wasn't just basketballers who were buying these shoes. Because they were using people with high social statuses, everybody wanted to buy these shoes.
And wear them all day, every day, yeah.
Yeah, and then the next big sort of turn or change in all of that came in the 1970s with the running boom. So, everyone started running in the 1970s. It became this big thing. We'd go jogging or yogging. And the funny thing is that, people had gone from very sedentary lifestyles to high impact running, pounding the pavement, and their bodies simply weren't ready for it. And so their bodies broke down. People got injured.
And also something interesting that Andy mentioned is that people were wearing fashionable footwear all day for their jobs, like dress shoes and high heels. And so then they go running in their flat athletic footwear, and their ankles and their calves are used to heels. So that was like a whole different load then.
And Nike saw a beautiful opportunity to essentially answer that problem by helping cushion that impact and soften that impact. And so the first cushion supportive heel was brought in. And, it definitely protected us from the impact, but all it was really doing was muting the signals that the body was trying to send us to say, hey, you're actually probably not ready for this activity, or the way you're engaging in this activity isn't the right way to engage in it. Which sort of brings us to today, where the market is saturated now with non-foot shaped shoes. Every pair is sold with a purpose behind it, and
more tech. There's more tech in each different shoe. They've got this air bubble or this, carbon fiber or whatever. Yeah.
And more tech equals less foot. It's like the more the tech, it's like this misnomer that shoes are the technology. It's like, no. The foot is the technology. The shoe's just supposed to be there to protect the tech. But the more tech we load into the shoe, the lower tech our feet become, to the point where they become so fragile and weak and stiff that it's like then we're actually forced to adopt more technology because we've lost our own internal tech.
And I think the big issue is where people mistake, say, a running shoe, and they are sold this belief that this shoe is better for your running because it's got all this tech in it. So as Nick said, more tech, less foot. But then they also get this idea that that's the right shoe to be wearing all day, every day. So even if there is a shoe that can help your performance in running, that doesn't mean that shoe is the right shoe to be wearing all day, every day for all of your activities. It may not even mean that it's the right shoe for running. But, there's the performance and health, there's kind of two different realms there. Like I know, I'm blanking on his name now, Kipchoge, wore the carbon fiber, I think they were Nikes. And, there's something to having more bounce and reactivity off the ground, and maybe it does help your performance. But that doesn't mean you want to be wearing that. That doesn't mean it's not going to be a trade-off for your foot health and function, basically. Yeah.
Look how Kipchoge runs. He actually runs well. Kipchoge, despite being in a cushioned shoe, whereas the average person, if you look how they run in a cushioned shoe, it's super unnatural.
Yeah.
And the only reason they're allowed to do that is because they have cushioning that masks the discomfort of slamming their heels into the ground first.
And overstriding,
yeah. So it's like almost the shoe, the technology in the shoe has gotten to such an extent that it gives us permission to sidestep the signals that would normally force us to run in alignment with what our bodies are designed to do. And over time,
kind of kicks the can down the road.
Yeah, and kicks the can upstream in your body too, because it's almost like people fail to connect the idea that the shoes you're wearing and what you're doing with your body all day are making you run in a certain way. And running, which is, people would love to think running is good for your health, and it can be, but if the way you run goes counter to the way your body's supposed to move, running can actually become something that brings you closer to injury. And
same as any sport, really. Or yeah.
I think it's fascinating when you look at that whole timeline, though, in its fullness, and how we've gone essentially from a period which was most of human existence, where we wore shoes only to protect our feet or to keep them warm in cold environments, or protect them from rough terrain. And there were the noble men and the noble women, the people of status who had the privilege to wear these shoes that didn't allow their feet to function. But for the large part of society, they understood that those shoes wouldn't allow them to perform the tasks that they needed to perform. And ever so gradually, as being able to attain shoes like noble men and women and became more accessible, and they were marketed to people, it's sort of like we lost our way somewhere in the middle there. And it probably aligned quite, I think if you looked at like a timeline as well, just the industrialization of work itself, and the fact that we weren't out in the fields having to sow and plow, and the function of our feet to achieve the work that we were having to do. We were now in factory floors with flat surfaces, and everything was manicured. The need for shoes that allowed us to feel the ground beneath our feet was sort of removed, at the same time as companies that were able to develop shoes that people, quote unquote, wanted, because they were latching on to these celebrity statuses and selling them to people based on that.
They made the status accessible by industrial processes of creating shoes. Because even up until before the Industrial Revolution, to get a shoe made would have been a big thing. Like you go to the cobbler, and you'd get it made at a cobbler, and that would be, I'm sure it would be an expensive process. And more and more people, as those processes became more accessible, more and more people would wear them. And I think especially something that I thought of as well is, back in the day, like in those Victorian eras, cities weren't clean. It was like pretty gross. There was sewage all over the place. There was animal feces and dung around the place, just because of the way the cities were set up. They didn't have like sewage systems. So having a shoe to separate your feet from the environment was actually like a kind of an important thing hygienically.
Yeah, it was a necessity.
And so...
Yeah, if you have a cut on your foot and you're walking through crap all day, it's probably not a good thing.
Yeah, so it's like there really is a function to footwear. Even in a city, and I know we get a lot of comments from people being like, well, what about the syringes and the shit on the sidewalk? And often the response to that is, well, just watch where you're walking. But also the response is, like if you don't feel confident that you can avoid those things, then footwear is the right option. But I think this view of bare feet being poor, dirty, and so on is basically outdated. That might have been the case 100, 200, 300 years ago or more, but it's no longer really the case today, because we've got pretty good sewage systems. We don't have animals pooing in the streets everywhere. People are starting to choose to go barefoot because they can actually feel the difference in their feet. It's a more rich experience to go barefoot, and also to have shoes or footwear as an option when the context is right.
And I think if everyone just viewed the shoes that they're purchasing through that lens of if we trace it back to that very beginning and go, the reason shoes started to get narrow was because they weren't meant to function well, because it meant that the wearer didn't have. That
was the whole reason.
That's the reason we've gotten here. Like, that was the turning point.
The heel and the narrowness, especially. And then the only reason a cushioned heel exists on athletic footwear is because those fashionable shoes became fashionable and basically disrupted the function of the foot and the ankle to the point that it couldn't function without that heel.
And everyone is aware of Chinese foot binding, for example, and you know,
And if you aren't, just look at pictures. It's pretty
Yeah.
gnarly.
yeah, it makes people retort when they see these
Trigger warning.
images. And trigger warning, but probably essential viewing if you haven't, because it puts this all into perspective. And, you know, those images are confronting, and people struggle to believe that people would do that to their feet.
And yet
But
it's still
it's
happening.
the essence of what's happening to this day.
To a lesser degree, but still very, very much a reality.
Absolutely. Yeah, if you go to like I used to work in residential aged care with physio, you look at all of their feet, it's not pretty because they're a lifetime in those shoes. It just doesn't happen as quickly, but a lifetime in pointy, restricted, stiff shoes will definitely affect your feet over time and deform your feet over time. It's just the sad reality of how the body adapts. Well, it's the sad reality of how the body adapts to those environments, to restrictive environments.
Yeah, so if we look at footwear and we view it as a tool, like I personally look at footwear as a really important tool. I think a lot of people, or some people, might have the perception that at the Foot Collective we are anti-shoe, and we're very much not. We're anti-shoes that disrupt foot health and just get in the way of natural foot function. But shoes are important. I live in Canada. There's a large part of the year where there's a lot of snow on the ground and the temperature is very low. And actually shoes are a critical tool for me to be able to go outside, move around, go for a walk. And I think the point is like, okay, let's view shoes let's put the fashion side to the side, right? Everyone wears shoes for different reasons. Some people wear it as a tool, as a form of self-expression, just like they like to dress differently. Footwear fundamentally is just clothing that's specialized to be put on our feet. And instead of just covering our body, it actually serves to protect our body. And so shoes are fundamentally a tool that we use to protect our feet because our feet are important sensors and important body parts. And you don't have to believe me in saying that. Just cut your foot or have a foot injury and see how much it disrupts your ability to be independent in ambulating around or get around. It really can be quite debilitating. So if shoes are a tool that protect our feet, what actually determines whether a shoe is good for your body, quote unquote, or bad for your body? And I think I've tried to spend a lot of time coming up with a clear explanation that makes it very simple and very clear for people to be able to make good decisions about the footwear they purchase. Because most people are going to purchase footwear every year. And if you slowly move towards buying better footwear that aligns with your foot function, the footwear you wear every day has the largest effect on the function of your feet. And so it's one of these rare things where the primary source of most foot dysfunction is the footwear people are wearing. And the primary solution to foot dysfunction is actually the footwear that you can start to wear that gives your feet an opportunity to heal. It doesn't, you can put great natural shoes on your feet, but if you sit on a couch all day, nothing's going to happen. So there is a requirement for natural inputs, for texture, for position variety, and load to be applied. But if you're not wearing natural footwear, you actually don't give your body an opportunity to restore its natural function. And so the sort of dichotomy that I've come up with that I think is intuitive enough that people can kind of get it without really needing much more explanation is natural footwear that allows our feet to function naturally, and then unnatural footwear, which actually disrupts the ability of our feet to function naturally. And so those are the two extremes. That's the binary categorization of two types of shoes at each end of this continuum. And the continuum means that along the way from unnatural to natural, there's all these different variations of how natural a shoe can be. And I think some people assume that you have to be either natural or unnatural, when in reality, there's all of these little gradients along the way. And as long as every time you're buying a shoe, you're actually making a slightly better choice to go closer to the natural end of the continuum, you're, I think, doing it the best way. Where you don't have to switch everything all at once. It's more about understanding the principles of shoes so that you can make a judgment every time you buy a pair of shoes to assess whether it's natural or unnatural and where on that continuum they fit, so that you can make better decisions about the shoes you wear, which allows you to actually have an opportunity to heal your feet.
I think that's an important delineation because there's a lot of buzzwords that get thrown out in this realm. There's barefoot shoes, minimalist shoes, and I think it's probably important for us to underline why we don't use those terms and we use natural footwear. I mean, yeah, Can you sort of dive into why you steered away from, using barefoot or minimalist?
Yeah, I think barefoot has a lot of baggage with it. First of all, it's actually an oxymoron because if you're barefoot, you're not wearing shoes. So to say barefoot shoes is kind of in the literal sense, kind of a confusing term. But I also think the baggage associated with barefoot shoes is that people automatically picture Vibrams, like a shoe with 5 individual toes. And, I personally think that those are great shoes, very functional shoes and like the epitome of utilitarian functional foot protection. But the reality is people aren't ready for those yet, right? People are so used to these narrow pointed shoes that is just too much of a separation from what they would consider normal to wear, right?
The common exclamation is, those shoes look like feet. Like,
Yeah,
that's so weird.
So weird. It's like if you see a helmet and it's shaped like a head, you don't think it's weird. You think it makes sense.
Or a glove that's shaped like a hand. Yeah. It's like, it is shaped like a hand, so that I can use my hand.
Work properly. Yeah,
it's shaped like the body parts designed to cover.
Yeah,
big shocker.
Interesting.
So I think barefoot shoes has a little bit of weirdness to it. It has a little bit of baggage, and then minimal just means less of. And the reality is that marketing departments for footwear companies have sort of hijacked that. And some of the shoes that I've seen that people call minimal are actually just slightly less of the same crap, and they're still very unnatural. And so it becomes this weird thing where there's too much gray there, and it's too unclear, and it allows marketing departments of footwear companies to actually start to use it as a buzzword to bring people in and make them think they're buying better shoes, when in reality it's just slightly less of the crap that you don't want in your shoes. So naturals at one end, unnaturals at the other. It's a continuum. And the way, early on people would constantly ask me, what shoes should I buy? And that was a really hard question to answer because in order for me to give any kind of educated response, I have to understand, well, what are you using the shoes for? What kind of foot strength do you have? How much time do you spend barefoot? There's so much time.
Just give me the answers, Nick.
Yeah,
I want to know.
People want the brand and the model and the size, and it's like, I can't answer these questions. But what I found was really helpful and aligns with empowerment is actually, well, if I'm going to look at a shoe, if I went to buy shoes with someone, what things would I look for in a shoe to determine if it's natural or unnatural? And the reality was those principles are actually extremely simple. And if people can actually understand those principles, every single time they go to make a shoe, they can make their own assessment of whether or not it's a shoe that aligns with foot function or not. And they can be really simple. So these started as WTFF, as in what the fuck footwear, but flexible and flat. Went to 4Fs, and now the one that we've landed on, the heuristic, is the 5Fs. And this is, if you listen to this in a year from now, it might be something different, but the goal is to make it be easy to remember, intuitive, and allow people this quick grab heuristic that they can, pull out in their minds when it comes to actually evaluating the footwear they're about to buy. So I'm going to quickly go through them, but they all relate to key features of footwear, which are shape, profile, and profile is essentially the difference in height between the rear part of the shoe and the front part. But I also include the profile of the sole, because the insole, if the profile of the insole includes artificial support, there's going to be a trade-off with that. So shape, profile, flexibility, sole thickness, and then fixation, which is how attached is the shoe to your foot. So I'm going to go through these quick. We talk about these a lot. We talk about it in the Map to Foot Freedom, and we're going to continue putting this out there, because I think the more touch points people get with this, the more they can understand this, the more empowered they can be to make wise footwear choices. So in terms of hierarchy, and these are all hierarchically ranked, meaning that the ones that are mentioned first are the most important. And if you had to prioritize, if you couldn't get all the boxes checked, make sure you check the upper boxes first, because they're going to have the largest effect on your foot health and your foot function. So the first one is foot shaped. So I've got this, on the video version of this podcast, I've got these Piaf Fledge sandals.
I'll be your little dummy.
Yeah, there you go. And if you look at the sole shape, a natural healthy foot that's never actually been put in footwear is widest at the tip of the toes. And so if you look at the footprint of that, it's got a straight first ray, straight toe, and it's widest at the tip of the toes, which actually goes into, like most unnatural shoes actually taper into a point. And obviously the craziest version of that is like a high heel that looks like a triangle. But actually, if you look at the modern men's dress shoe or the modern running shoe, they all taper into a point and therefore cause your toes to be squished together, causing things like bunions or neuromas, and really just deactivating the stabilizers of the foot by squishing it together. So the first one is foot shape. It's the most important.
That also relates to arch control as well. So your ability to control pronation is heavily related to the alignment of your big toe and the width of your toe splay. So a lot of people are sort of being assessed and seeing, well, you've got overpronation, you're pronating too much, and a lot of that is because their foot is squished into a narrow shape.
I think also on that point, it's important to recognize that if you've been wearing narrow shoes your entire life, this may not be the shape of your foot.
Yeah.
Your foot may be already tapering into a point, but that doesn't mean you need to keep wearing a shoe that's shaped like your foot.
It should more be like anatomically foot shaped, like how a foot is shaped when you're born, which is widest at the toes.
Yeah. And also, I think it's, a good little trick for people is if you go into a shoe store, you go and, go to try on a pair of shoes, if you can take the insole out of that shoe, put it on the ground, and then put your foot on top of it, it's a really good way to tell. Obviously, if you put your foot inside the shoe, you should be able to feel it being pushed in. But if you're so used to that feeling,
more visual.
It's a big aha moment because I remember Ray McClanahan talked about how there was this young kid that came in to see him and had all these issues with his toes getting compressed together and was starting to get even like a bunion, I believe. And Ray told the parents, like, you need to get him some foot-shaped shoes. And the parents were like, no, we buy him good shoes. And he didn't say a word. He literally just took the sock liner out, put their son's foot on it, and just saw their faces melt, being like, oh my God, I've been deceived, or I was totally wrong. And so I think it really is a good visual, because if your foot is literally overflowing over the insole, like, clearly that shoe doesn't have enough space for all your toes. And so your toes have to be all squished. Sometimes they even overlap over each other, and it just messes up the entire biomechanics of the foot. So first one is the shape, and it's, a natural shoe is foot shaped. The second one, and we're kind of playing with where we put the fixation point, the fixation piece, because if we're labeling these hierarchically, it's kind of a game to find out which ones have the biggest trade-offs and the biggest effect. But for now, let's put fixation second. And so really you want a shoe, this really just rules out flip-flops or thongs, which have no ankle fixation point. And the problem with flip-flops is that you actually have to pressurize your big toe to stop it from flying off your foot. Maybe not to a huge degree, but when you're stepping through your foot at the exact point where your big toe should be extending, you actually have to kind of push down a little bit of pressure to stop. If you've ever tried running in flip-flops, it's like a really hard thing to do, because you have to keep pressure to stop it from flying off your foot. And all you have to add to a pair of flip-flops or thongs is an ankle fixation point, like we have on these P.L. Sledge sandals, or Shamas or Earth Runners. A lot of companies making these. And that actually allows it to be natural instead of unnatural. So shape, fixation point. The third one is flat. So this has to do with the profile of the shoe. So from the heel to the toes, it's the same height. It's flat. There's no higher area at the heel than at the toes, because we're not meant to stand on ramps all day. And so you want foot shaped, fixed to your foot, flat. The next one is flexible. So each of your feet has 26 bones, 33 joints, which means it's designed for a huge amount of movement. And a flexibility test for the shoe is actually incredibly simple. You grab it, you twist it, you bend it, you fold it. The more resistance there is to being able to do that, the less mobility that shoe is going to permit to your foot when it's moving.
So if it's not flexible, it kind of acts like a cast on your foot. Just like when you cast a body part to, I had broke my wrist when I was young. When I got out of that cast after 6 weeks, my wrist was really stiff because it had been in one position for a long time. That was for the healing of the bone. So sometimes casting short term makes sense, but casting long term is only going to disrupt the function and the flexibility and the mobility.
And if you use the metaphor of the glove again, if you were to wear a glove on your hand that didn't allow your fingers to bend, what good is the glove? And the feet have a heap of hardware in there for a reason. So
the only reason, there's 33 joints in each foot. The only reason for a joint to exist in the body is for movement to happen. If you didn't need movement to happen in an area, then there wouldn't be a joint. So
your whole foot would be one bone.
Yeah,
if you didn't need movement.
And even though they're small movements, yes, but all those movements add up to be able to provide an adaptable foot, so that you can actually adapt to a lot of different surfaces and even adapt to the loads that you're putting. Even if it's on a flat surface, then walking, running, jumping, they all require you to absorb load from the ground and then and then use that efficiently and turn that into power and energy.
And even for the flat point, I'll just backtrack one sec. For flat, not only the global profile of the shoe from heel to toe, but also the inner profile of the footbed should be flat. And I think that's one part where, you know, the more support the more artificial support you provide externally to your foot, the less support needs to be achieved from the foot itself. And the arch of the foot and all the muscles that are built into there, you have 4 layers of muscles, and you have all these different bones that orient in such a way that the foot is actually a very stable structure when it needs to be stable. The more artificial support you provide your foot, the weaker your foot becomes as a result of that. And so having a flat global profile from heel to toe, but also a flat inner profile on the footbed of the shoe is very important, because then, again, less external support, more internal support is asked of your foot, therefore your foot gets stronger.
I think this is a real tough one for people to comprehend, because obviously orthotics, are huge in the podiatry game, and all the marketing that comes from footwear brands is about extra support and extra cushioning, and the whole flat foot dilemma of people being labeled with flat feet. I mean, this is a really tough one to... I struggle to have this conversation with people who have been told their entire life that they have flat feet, or a collapsed arch, and their foot is broken and they need the support.
And supportive shoes have become synonymous with good. Like, it's even said in the same sentence, oh, I know I need to get some good supportive shoes.
Yeah.
Or you really need to be in good supportive shoes. It's like, it's become synonymous, but the support might be useful in certain contexts, like protecting the foot from overload, but it's not a helpful long-term strategy, because over time, if you support any body part, it's like if you support your back or your neck with a brace, might be helpful to heal from an injury very short term, possibly, but over time it's going to weaken and stiffen the back or the neck. So
and do you want to be wearing the brace for your whole life?
Do you want to be dependent on the brace? Probably not.
Yeah, it's like saying supportive shoes are good for your feet is like saying a supportive crutch is good for your leg. It's
Yeah.
like, maybe in certain circumstances, but as a blanket statement to say, yeah, crutches are great for your body. It's like people would probably say like, nah, I don't think that's true.
Yeah.
Right? But with the feet, it seems like there's so much power of footwear. Footwear companies have so much money for marketing that they can literally convince people they need all these things and the things are better for them, when in reality, the irony is those are the very things that are causing people's feet to be dysfunctional.
Yeah.
And so, again, we're not here to tell you what shoes to wear. We're simply here to provide you truthful, helpful information so that you can make wise choices with your footwear, knowing the trade-offs that are being made when you wear shoes with cushioning or stiffness or support, etc.
Last thing on the flat as well, just to come back to it, is that a heeled shoe kind of acts like a cast, just like we were talking about with flexible, how all the joints in the feet can't move if there's a stiff, rigid shoe. Then with flat, a heeled shoe that isn't flat kind of acts like a cast for your ankles, because if you're constantly in plantar flexion because you're up on a heel, up on a ramp, you don't get anywhere near as much opportunity to get into dorsiflexion. So that limits your dorsiflexion, which, as we know, the body is use it or lose it. If you don't use that dorsiflexion movement regularly, then over time you lose your ability. So there's that. There's also the compensations upstream that happen from standing on a ramp. I like your analogy, Nick, of the Jenga blocks. And there's a good image of this in Katie Bowman's book, Whole Body Barefoot, where if you put your feet on a ramp, or even if you just go and stand on a decline board or a hill, all the joints upstream change their position to keep you upright. Otherwise, you'd just be leaning forward. So a ramp just causes all of these compensations upstream, which, yes, the body can compensate, but there will be a trade-off for that compensation.
Yeah, I find it very interesting that high heels, when you stick a really big wedge under someone's heel, it tilts their pelvis forward and it kind of makes their ribs flare up a little bit, which ironically accentuates the bum and the breasts of a woman. Yeah. So high heels are these very odd things. It's like, it makes sense that, it's a very interesting thing, what it does to the body, and it's maybe not as surprising that, if a woman wants to, and obviously everyone wears shoes for their own reasons, I'm not judging that, but it's very interesting when you see all the postural corrections that happen, you correlate them to, oh, they actually accentuate the body parts that men like to look at most. So maybe that has something to do with why women wear heels.
It's a fashion, again, it's an aesthetic thing, not a functional thing.
Yes.
The last thing on flat as well is the front of the shoe. So the toe spring is a really common thing in a lot of shoes, where there's like a little raised lip, I suppose, at the front of the shoe, and just being aware that that will essentially take away from the amount of toe extension mobility that you have to express while you're walking, running, jumping, etc. And therefore your toes will also become more and more stiff, which a lot of people will eventually experience as hallux rigidus, limitus, that can also contribute to bunions forming. So so flat, lots of different elements to flat.
I challenge people to just analyze, shoes a little more deeply, ones that they already own. I mean, Hoka's are a very big ramp. With that toe spring is quite obvious, but you'll find that when you look a bit deeper at sports shoes that are out there, that little lip at the front is just
ubiquitous almost.
Yeah,
It's not so little sometimes.
No.
So we've covered foot shaped, fixed, flat, flexible, and the last one, the F stands for feel, which really just means thin sole. The thinner the sole of the shoes you use, the more sensory input and texture and surface variety you're going to be able to experience in your foot. And actually the foot is an important sensor. It's designed to sense the external environment. And every piece of texture or angulation in the surface that you're standing on provides your foot some information that your body uses to make a wise choice about what movement pattern to express as an output. So the 5 Fs are foot shaped, fixed to your foot, flat, flexible, and feel, meaning a thin sole. And so really, if you're looking at every pair of shoes, put it through that filter and allow yourself to sort of get an idea of the continuum where a shoe that is pointed, super stiff, ramped, or not fixed to your foot and has a really thick layer of cushioning is unnatural, whereas a shoe that is foot-shaped, flat from heel to toe, flat on the footbed, is flexible, has a really thin sole, and has a fixation point to your foot is natural. And so really, the best thing you can do to improve your foot health is to really put every shoe that you choose to purchase through a tighter filter and make sure that every shoe you buy is more natural compared to the previous shoe. Slowly phase out your unnatural shoes. And from our perspective, providing good information empowers people to make better choices in their footwear, which allows them to restore their foot health in a way that they protect their foot from unnatural shoes first, so that the work they're doing to correct their foot function and develop more resilient feet isn't wasted. Because if you spend 2 hours a day trying to restore your foot function and develop capacity, but you spend 8 hours a day in shoes that are essentially subtracting all of that from you, it can be a really frustrating process. So those are the 5 Fs.
And I think it's important to note that it's something we stress all the time. Shoes do have their purpose in certain circumstances, and obviously in an ideal world, you would wear the thinnest sole that would allow your feet to feel the ground. But if you're working on a work site, we get it. You need a layer of protection beneath what you may step on, whether it's nails or whatever. Some people need to wear a steel-toed cat boot. So there are circumstances where some of those 5 Fs need to be, there needs to be a little bit of give and take. We understand that, but really like Nick said, it's about what you're spending most of your day in and ensuring that you're trying to do everything you can to maximize the benefits that you're getting out of the
you just get as close as possible. A lot of people reach out and say, is there any natural, they usually would use the term barefoot, but is there any natural work boots or steel cat boots? And frankly, the answer right now is no. But there are much wider steel cat boots. There's a Birkenstock, there's a company called Wide Load as well. So there's wider and flatter boots. So that's something. So it's knowing, maybe I can't get a fully natural work boot or whatever it is, but I can go closer to that. And that will make a difference, even though, it's not perfect, it will make a difference. And then also acknowledging, I have to wear my work boot all day, every day. It isn't flexible and it isn't, thin. So I acknowledge that there's a trade-off there. My foot function will be affected, and therefore I'm going to do more foot stuff, more foot training.
Spend time barefoot.
Spend time more barefoot when you can. Whereas I think people feel like it's a bit all or nothing. It's like, well, I can't be in those shoes all the time, therefore I'm not going to do any foot training, I'm not going to do any barefoot time, I'm not going to change my other daily shoes, and it's like it all becomes a bit hopeless.
Yeah, and your daily drivers have the largest impact on your foot health. So the daily drivers I would consider shoes that you're wearing every day that you're not at work. Or if you can wear just whatever shoes you want at work, the shoes that you wear most frequently. They have the largest impact on your foot health. So if you're a hockey player and you spend 6 hours a week in skates, you're never going to find a natural hockey skate because it's fundamentally an unnatural sport. And you actually don't need to. You just have to make sure that you're doing stuff to take care of your feet when you're out of your skates to offset those effects. And frankly, if your daily drivers are natural and you're spending a bit of time barefoot, you're going to be fine.
Yeah. That's a good one. Is I think a lot of people, well, not a lot of people, I have seen comments of saying that we're fear-mongering by saying to people that, rigid shoes are affecting your feet or deforming your feet. But it's like, well, is it fear-mongering to say that cigarettes cause lung cancer?
Right.
Like there's a line, and it's not about saying like, whoa, any time you spend in a narrow shoe is going to completely destroy your feet. If you are doing all of the right things, like you said, Nick, daily drivers, you're doing foot training, you're wearing spreaders if if you've got issues with toe splay, and spending time barefoot, sure, go and spend a night in heels or whatever you want to do with your feet, and they will probably be fine because they have built up a layer of resilience. But over time, you'll probably find that you're just drawn to those shoes less anyway, because you realize how constrictive or restrictive they feel.
I think there was some interesting research done after the pandemic, and it sort of goes to show the importance of having awareness of the things that we're talking about. So when people went back to work, a lot of people had obviously been working from home, and there was some research done that found that when people went back to work, there was a spike in people experiencing foot pain. And obviously everyone had been at home where they didn't have to wear shoes and then have gone back into wearing their work shoes. I think a large proportion of the people, that were that sort of submitted for the research were office workers. And it was interesting. The article that I read had a podiatrist on it, and the podiatrist essentially blamed the fact that people had been barefoot too much and that it was their fault for going barefoot at home.
Because it had made their feet wider. It was like, going barefoot more makes your feet wider, and therefore you have less tolerance to your narrow shoes.
That's an interesting spin on it.
Yeah, it's like the problem is going barefoot so much that your feet go wider, not the problem being the actual narrow shoes.
Yeah, it's like you shouldn't have made your feet so darn healthy at home because now you're not going to be able to wear the unnatural shoes anymore.
And there are people who go like, I love you guys, but I hate you as well because now I can't go back to my my like shoes that I spent probably thousands of dollars on and really love the look of, but I just can't anymore because they feel too bad. They feel too restrictive.
Once you
Sorry,
exactly.
Yeah.
But it's like letting go of that deep-seated, generational belief that these shoes are good for me and these shoes
are
part of my identity.
Well, yeah, that's true.
It's letting go of that, and it's super freeing.
It is.
Like being able to strip back your wardrobe and get rid of all of these shoes that, I think the other interesting point to note is, I think we convince ourselves that when we buy a pair of shoes, I always remember the idea of I'm going to wear them in. The shoes are uncomfortable at the beginning. My feet just need to get used to these shoes and wear them in. But really, they were wearing us out. They were wearing our feet out.
Wearing us down.
Yeah, 100%. And even just being conscious of if people sort of reflect on their own experiences in shoe stores, whether it was when they were younger or even as an adult, and the advice that you're given and the way that even your foot inside the shoe is measured. It's always the end of the shoe is grabbed to see if your toes, right at the end of the shoe. But is there any consideration given to how it felt on the sides of your feet?
Yeah, well, even wide shoes that are marketed as wide are often widest at the ball of the foot.
Well, that's why
which is the wrong place for width.
Because it used to be WTFF, and
Yeah.
then I think it was Ray McClanahan was like, I stopped using the word wide because all the shoes that are marketed as wide are still pointed.
Yeah, they're wide at the ball
the
and then
spot.
finish at a point.
Yeah,
So
so
it's-
foot shaped.
Yeah, foot shaped. Yeah.
So we know what shoes we should be looking for, but the most important thing really is to make sure you're ready for wearing those shoes. So
Yeah.
how do they do it?
Well, yeah, so it's important to acknowledge that movement and loads, so physical loads, are kind of like food or nutrients or even like drugs for our cells. So this, I take this concept, I really love it, from Katie Bowman of like nutritious movement. And so there is actually a process called mechanotransduction, where mechanical forces that the body experiences either internally or externally create biochemical effects in our cells. And a really easy way to visualize that, or a really easy example, is if you go on bed rest for 6 weeks, your bone mineral density and your muscle mass will decrease regardless of how much protein or minerals or calcium or whatever that you're taking in through food. So the movement and the loads of resisting gravity, essentially standing up, walking around, are actually literally nutrients for your bones and muscles and joints. And so that's pretty easy to acknowledge for the musculoskeletal system. Same thing applies to every other system in our body. The movement is like a nutrient for all of our body systems. But it's also important to acknowledge that there is a dose response with movement and loads. So just like with food, or let's use a nutrient, or like salt is a good example, nice and easy one. A little bit of salt is really good for you. It hydrates you, makes your food taste nice, which is cool. But really, really important for our body's functioning is some salt intake. But if you have a pound of salt, then you're not going to have a good time. You might die.
You will die.
If
you will. Eat a pound of salt, you're dead.
Yeah,
100%.
yeah. I'm pretty sure that was what you said. I couldn't remember if it was a pound or a kilo. I didn't want to. Yeah. Either way, it's a lot of salt.
Yeah.
But you get the idea there. That's it's an extreme example, but it's a good one, because it's like, well, is salt good for you or not? Well, what's the context? How much are you having in how short a time? So dose response is real. And they're usually, like most things, it's on a bell curve. You either have not enough load to really make much of a difference at all on your cells that make an adaptation. There's like no discomfort involved. It's just like, if I just sit here and wave my hand around, my body's not really going to adapt. It's just a very minimal load. Then you've got the too much load. Pain or injury happens usually when it's too much load. There's high discomfort, it's pretty much intolerable, and you don't really get anywhere. You don't get a favorable adaptation. And then you've got the sweet spot at the top of the bell curve, which is just the right amount of load. You get consistent and favorable adaptations. And yes, there is some discomfort, because you kind of have to expose yourself to discomfort in order to grow and adapt. So changing footwear, especially moving towards more of the natural side, does change the load on your feet and on the rest of your body. So foot-shaped, there's really no reason why foot-shaped would affect you negatively. But once you get into like sort of the flat section, that's going to apply more load into your big toe, like we said, with the extension, or all your toes for extension. It's also going to apply more load to your ankle. So if you're a runner and you are in cushioned heeled running shoes and you're doing, say, 10K a day or every couple of days, and then you get a flat shoe and you go straight out and do the exact same volume, that's going to be a much higher load experienced on your feet and ankles, and you're going to feel it, basically.
Could be too much.
Yeah, could definitely be too much, and a lot of that depends on how you're interacting with the ground, what your running technique is like. So there's a lot of factors, but very likely that will be too much load, and it'll be in that sort of other end of the bell curve where you're going to get some high discomfort, and you're not going to get a favorable adaptation out of that. The other thing to be aware of here is that your recovery also matters a lot. So the way you're sleeping, the way you're eating, how much stress you're exposed to, all of those things will affect the way your body experiences those loads and recovers from those loads, obviously. But all of this is to say that you do need to self-regulate along the way. There's no one who can tell you exactly how much load is going to be the exact right amount for your body. But your body will tell you if you listen to it.
Yep.
And that can be that's kind of a skill in itself, because we're never really taught how to listen to our bodies, and in fact we're actually taught really the wrong way, which is if you're in pain, we need to cover up the pain with something, painkillers or XYZ.
Literally ignore your body.
Just ignore the signals, basically. And there's almost like this what's the word? I'm not going to say heroic, but it's like, oh yeah, like it's like an athlete thing, like a sports thing. Like, yeah, I'm in pain, I'm injured, but I'm just going to play because, I'm going to do it for the team, or want the glory, or I just love it too much, so I'm going to play.
Like a virtue.
It's like a virtue, yeah. And it's like, well, maybe in some contexts, if you're fighting a war or something, then yeah, you're going to have to push through some pain, but it's really not going to help you in the long term. To do that, and it's much better to actually really listen in. And usually the body gives you whispers, and then it'll talk to you, and then it'll yell at you, and then it'll scream at you.
Yep.
So the whispers are obviously harder to tune into, but that's the best opportunity to listen, because you can adjust things early before it needs to talk or yell or scream. If you can't listen to it whisper, at least listen to it talk and really listen to it. It's not an exact science. It's really just taking the time to check in with your body every morning, every night. I think a journal is a really good thing to use to just track what symptoms are you experiencing, what are the other factors that are going on with your recovery, why might you be feeling certain symptoms. And I've actually, in our Explorer program, we sort of systemize that with what we call a proof of work log. And people get a lot out of it. I see their responses, they're writing, oh, my ankle was hurting today. And then they've written, probably because I did a run yesterday and I haven't been running for the last 2 years. And it sort of seems a little too simple, but sometimes it doesn't click until people feel like something's random until you say, well, what have you been doing recently that might have contributed to that? Oh, well, I did pick up running actually. Oh, okay, well that might be why. And it's like just learning to add up the variables that are going on and go, okay, well, this is probably why. I'm going to try and tweak this variable.
Yep.
And then I'll see if I get a different outcome. It's kind of like that process of becoming your own scientist and just being okay with some discomfort, not seeing it as like a failure if you have a flare-up of pain or if you can't do your usual volume. It's just like, okay, this is what's happening, this is what my body is saying, and this is how I'm going to respond to that signal. So yeah, as I was sort of getting to before, the transition is pretty important in those hierarchical 5Fs. Foot shaped, there's really no reason to avoid it. Fixation, there's no reason to avoid it. Just those two are like really great just to start with. Your body's not going to experience too much load from that. Flat, you may need to gradually reduce your heel height.
And your internals and the support.
And the support and the toe spring. So yeah, whether that's buying a completely flat pair of shoes without internal support, but you still wear a custom insole for some time, something that's like modifiable, and you can try with the insole, you can try without the insole. Whereas if it's just always got the insole in there, then you're never actually able to try it without it. Some people, I know Andy recommends some people go into a pair of natural footwear, but they still wear their orthotic for a certain amount of time because there'll still be stimulus and loads from the natural footwear that the person can benefit from without actually having to remove all of the support. On that topic of orthotics, I think that this whole topic of loads, I think that's why orthotics became so big, is because we can't get through our daily life without loading our feet because they're our foundation. So if you hurt your shoulder, you can use the other hand, you can walk around, you can basically avoid loading that shoulder to allow it time to recover. But if you hurt your foot and standing on it, walking on it hurts and you can't get through your day, you can't really avoid that. So that's why the orthotic industry, I think, is so big. It's like, well, this is going to help you alter the loads, or I think originally it was sold originally as like aligning you properly. But really it is just altering the loads, reducing the loads, so that you can get through your day without flaring up the issue. So there is a role for those in certain contexts. Ideally, for the vast majority of people, you want to have an exit plan from them. But yeah, you may need to gradually reduce the heel, reduce the support, and may need to gradually reduce the toe spring as well. So that's important because, like I said, the ankle might get loaded too much, the big toe might get loaded too much, and you might get some symptoms. Same with flexible, may need to gradually increase the flexibility. I feel like that kind of relates to the toe spring as well. I think where most people get irritated with the flexibility is when their big toe is being asked, they're asking too much of their big toe and they basically overstretch it. Then the feel as well. I think when people step into a natural, like fully thin pair of footwear, it's like, whoa, I can feel everything on the ground. And it's like quite confronting because they're just not used, their feet are usually blindfolded. They're not used to that. So yeah, you may need to gradually reduce the sole thickness depending on the surface you're going on, which again is fine. As long as Nick said, you're moving in that direction each time. And something that I would say, and what we often say, is that you'll probably be surprised how quickly your feet adapt. Yeah. Especially if you've got all those other recovery things going, and especially if you're also adding in some specific targeted training to improve the foot function. Because often, yeah, if you just go into natural footwear, that is a really good step. But there are dysfunctions that have accumulated over time from being in unnatural footwear, and if you do some targeted activities to improve your load tolerance, then that will carry over directly into the shoes that you're wearing. So yeah, we've got a bunch on our YouTube channel. We've got the Transform Your Feet with a Towel video. That is the perfect place for anyone to start. And then obviously
even the foot restoration videos.
Foot restoration, yep. There's a foot exploration video. There's a lot of great stuff in there for you to get started restoring function. And then we've also obviously got our Soulmate sessions, which are a more explorative, play-based way to... It will also help you restore foot function, but not only that, it will help you integrate the foot function with your hip stability, with your ankles, knees, and whole body, basically, is the idea behind that training.
And then if anything that we talked about today, you want a written form of, I write a blog at soulefreedom, soleFreedom.ca. And they're quick 5-minute reads. There's one on natural footwear, unnatural footwear, and there's one about transitioning to natural footwear. So a lot of overlap with what we said today, but if you prefer a written form that you can go access anytime, soulefreedom.ca, click blog, and there's a couple little written pieces there.
And the guide to foot freedom too.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that
that's probably the primary reason.
Yeah, actually. I'd say like if you've got a friend or a family member, I mean, if you've listened to this podcast, you've got most of the good, juicy information there. But if you've got a friend or family member who, maybe won't listen to you if you try and explain it, or isn't ready to listen to a podcast, the Guide to Foot Freedom is a really great place to start. It's a completely free ebook with a heap of education and knowledge in there that runs through all of the things that we've covered today, but in a hard copy form that's pretty hard to argue with. And it's got links to some of the training that we've got, some more educational videos from our recent play shops. So it's sort of packed full of information. We'll have a link to that in the show notes, and I'd really recommend people check that out. But one point I just wanted to make was, Jim's just described getting, a pair of natural footwear for this and then transitioning to another natural pair of footwear. And I can hear people, and people say this to us all the time. It's like, they're too expensive. Like, I can't afford to go buy another pair of shoes and then another pair of shoes. Or if I've got kids, like, I can't afford to do this and then this. And firstly, I think it's good to be aware that there is a wide price bracket of natural footwear out there now. Saguaro make quite an accessible pair of natural footwear, and obviously, the prices increase from there, and they can get up to a couple of hundred, a few $100 a pair. But I just challenge people to consider, firstly, how much they'd spend on orthotics every couple of years. You're essentially, if you're transitioning to this footwear, ideally you're removing that cost. You're also then removing the cost of having to see a podiatrist, which is almost a pair of shoes the first time you see them, let alone how many times you're going to have to see them throughout your life if you continue to wear those orthotics. And to be honest, I like to put it in the context of a pillow. Are you going, or the bed that you sleep on? You're not going to be a super cheapskate and buy a really stiff bed that, you know, isn't necessarily comfortable for you, but that's where you're spending 8 hours a night. And that's a whole other rabbit hole we could get down about whether you should be lying in a bed or not. You know, like I like a stiff bed, but again, I guess what I'm trying to say is
you're not going to get a really crappy bed, basically.
When you're spending a third of your day in it, but you're spending a third of your day in shoes, so invest in your feet. Don't feel like they're a detached body part that you can just throw away. And, you know, and I just beg for parents to consider that with their children.
It's an investment.
And you can imagine, it's like, if a pair of natural shoes are actually the ultimate therapist that's with you at all times, that actually helps your feet sort of heal them, or gives your feet an opportunity to heal themselves, it's like it's no longer just a piece of clothing. It's actually like an orthopedic device that's helping your body restore its natural function. And it becomes something that is actually more important than just a piece of clothing that you put on. And like Max said, there's a wide variety of price points and there's more and more brands making better and better shoes that are more accessible, lower priced. And, you know, I think the key is for people to have a wide variety of choice available to them. And regardless of what you want to spend on a pair of shoes based on the value you see in terms of how those shoes are going to affect your foot function, it's more about you're going to buy shoes, just put in a little bit of extra work to find brands of shoes that are within your price range that are more natural, because natural shoes might be a bit more expensive right now, but having unrelenting foot pain is very expensive in terms of your energy and the cost that you're going to pay to get it treated.
And we're trying to make it super easy for you. We now have a natural footwear finder page where you can go, you can see all of the brands that we've tested, we've tried, that align with our ethos and what we're trying to achieve with this. These are natural footwear brands from all over the world. And, you know, we're teaming up with brands like this because we do need to change this narrative. We need to make natural footwear the most common and popular footwear on the planet for the good of everyone's health. And you would not see Nike and Adidas working side by side to promote natural foot health or anything. But we are trying to bring all of these natural footwear brands, the little guys, together, because together we believe that, you know, we will have the power to make this.
We need to shift the culture, basically.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because at the moment, we're kind of like in our own little echo chamber, but if you go for a walk, probably 99.9% of people you see are wearing conventional footwear that is narrow, heeled, cushioned, restrictive.
Yep.
There's a massive change that needs to happen. And the only way to do that is together, basically, to create that shift so that
it's us being advocates, it's the brands being advocates, but it's you being an advocate for the footwear that you're putting on your feet. And I think once you experience it, you will become an advocate. And we talk about this all the time, but you'll go to the shops and you'll see someone else with natural footwear. And it's almost like this hidden...
It's like, oh, nice shoes.
Yeah. The amount of extra people you get to connect with just by changing your footwear as well. It's a little cheat code.
It's like a if you know, you know kind of thing.
Yeah.
Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you feel it, you can't unfeel it.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think it all starts with an understanding of, number one, your feet are actually important in terms of the foundation for your body. Number two, the footwear you wear has the biggest effect on the health of your feet. And number three, understanding how to evaluate every pair of shoes you buy so that you're gradually but surely moving towards the natural end of the continuum, so that the footwear you wear ends up being something that promotes natural foot function instead of leading you down a path of unnatural foot function, which can result in pain and issues down the road.
And number four, learning how to listen to your body and adapt appropriately, basically. Sweet.
I think that covers it. If you're looking for a pair of shoes, I recommend checking out the Natural Footwear page. We've got a heap of brands there.
Where do people find that?
They go to thefootcollective.com. The link will be in the show notes. Just, thefootcollective.com. And there's some discount codes there too for brand partners as well. So
Perfect.
Hopefully you can find a pair that works for you.
Thanks
Sweet.
for listening.
Thanks for listening.